Hi, welcome everyone. We'll just wait a few more minutes as a few other people join us. Thank you. Again, welcome everybody. We're not quite at 7:30 and we've still got a few people joining. Thanks for your patience. Welcome to Valley Seed's first virtual field days. I'm Jo Tanner, Valley Seed's National Sales and Marketing Manager. Our event is held over 2 nights and 3 short videos. Tonight we'll cover persistence and management of perennial pastures, and Valley Seed's plant breeder Anthony Leddin will be our presenter. I'll just take you through a few housekeeping points. If you refer to the slide on the screen, we'll go through how to ask questions and make sure you can see and hear everything. You'll notice that there is actually a box that has questions. If you drop that down, you'll be able to type your question in there. Then there's also handouts. If you want to actually download any of those, they're there for your reference, or you can receive them later on. If you want to raise questions, you'll be on mute, so it is advised to go through the question box. If you need to speak to one of us independently, you can also use the chat box, but we would prefer questions to go through the question box. I would now like to introduce Donald Coles, who's the Director and Owner of Valley Seeds, with his wife, Elizabeth Coles.
Thank you, Jo, and welcome everybody to the second night of our virtual field day. Tonight we've got the exciting opportunity to listen to our Chief Plant Breeder, Anthony Leddin. The company was formed in 1972 by my father, Jim Coles, and over the last 48 years we've been using the latest breeding technology in order to develop varieties specifically for Australia. And Anthony's the chief amongst using that developed knowledge over that time. He's bred a very large number of varieties, and I have to say, given the number of varieties he's bred, he's without a doubt Australia's most foremost pasture grass breeder, with several varieties not only on the market in Australia, but a number that we've registered in the marketing overseas in different countries such as Spain, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and even the USA. So this Australian company that's born of a local breeder from Anthony Leddin is now exporting globally. We hope to expand that over time, but our chief responsibility, and that of Anthony will make very clear to you tonight, is for Australia and for Australian farmers. So tonight is all about you, and it's about what we can do to service your needs to make your pasture system a more profitable, more sustainable activity, and of course profitable in the long term. So I'd now like to hand back to Jo to introduce Anthony to take on and go through his whole seminar tonight. Thank you for attending, and there'll be questions obviously after. Please feel free to do that. And of course, if there are any other questions, not only can you use the chat function, but you can contact us directly. Anytime, just call up the Valley Seeds number, 1-800-226-905. And there are videos on the website, so you'll be able to use those as well. Thanks very much, Jo. Over to you.
Thank you, Donald. I'll now hand it over to Anthony Leddin, Valley Seeds plant breeder and founder of Plant Breeders Without Borders.
Hi everyone, it's Anthony Leddin here, and when I have field days, the most common question that I'm asked by farmers and agronomists is how do we get our perennial grasses to persist for longer and produce as much feed as possible. So tonight I'm sort of going to go through the topic of what's happening with the variable climates that we're experiencing and how they're affecting the different perennial grasses we have in the system, and what's the future hold. So what sort of species would I be looking at to try and grow to match the sort of climate that we're going to have in the future and be persistent and productive as you want them in your pastures. So this map here, it's not the Republicans versus the Democrats, so you don't have to worry about that. It's basically the rainfall distribution over Australia and last year's drought. And you can see Australia was dramatically affected, especially where we grow a lot of our temperate pasture species. In that situation, you can see that Australia has a very variable climate, and we're experiencing this variability a lot more than what other countries are around the world. And at the moment, I don't know if you know, but we get a lot of our pasture varieties that are sold in the marketplace come from overseas. So they either come from New Zealand or North America or from Europe. And so we're experiencing these changes in our climate much more rapidly than these other places. And it really sends alarm bells to us as farmers to say we really need to start looking at material developed and bred in Australia that's more adapted to our environmental conditions and the rapid changes that are happening here. And that's what Valley Seeds is doing.
Anthony, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we've just, the audience has let us know there was some interference just as you were noting what the common question was. Would you mind just letting us know again what the common question is you get asked?
Okay, so the common question that I'm usually asked is in field days is what is the persistence of varieties and why are we seeing varieties not persist as well as what they have in the past? So this talk that I'm basically going to give you is explaining why that persistency is being affected and what you can do about it from a management point of view, and what sort of species I'll be choosing to select and adapt to this changing climate that we're experiencing here in Australia. So just going back to the map that we've got up here. So as I said, Australia's climate's changing quite more rapidly than where we're receiving a lot of our varieties from currently around the world. So it's much better to try and do the breeding here and try and get material more adapted to our rapidly changing climate to help with its persistence and productivity. So last year was a year where Australia got a lot of records, and they're not real records that we'd like to see. So with driest annual rainfall event ever recorded in Australia and some of the highest temperatures. And so in this presentation, I'll talk about the effect of moisture and the effect of temperature on some of the temperate species and how it affects their persistence. So I just wanted to draw you a bit of a map here, and anyone can do this on the website link that I've got here. Our head office is at Yark in northeast Victoria, and one of the closest towns to there is a place called Benalla. So if you draw a line from Benalla, which is the white dot there, and you use the modelling of climate that's predicted for that location in 2030, you can actually draw lines to different locations in Australia which has a climate now that would be what Benalla would experience in 2030. So you can see over in Western Australia, there's Esperance, in South Australia, there's Clare, and right through New South Wales, it goes from Forbes right through down to Albury. So if I was a farmer, what I would do is I would go to some of these locations and look at some of the species that they're growing there currently and the management that they're applying to those species, and then think about trying to apply them to my farm in the future to make it more climate ready. So what does the modelling predict for pasture growth? So this is a model basically done for Tasmania, but it's really applicable to the southeast coast of Australia. And what the predictions are holding for us is that as we go on in time, we're going to see less spring rainfalls. So our springs are going to get shorter. And that has a big effect on some of the perennial species that we grow on our farm. We've been encouraged in the past to grow a lot of late heading material because that material has the ability to carry on later into the season and hold its quality longer. But it can only do that if it has moisture to be able to grow. So if you think about this fact, about 60% of the annual dry matter yield of a perennial grass is around its heading date. So the later a variety heads, the more it's going to produce at that later time of the season. So if you have quite a late heading variety heading at the end of November, if you've run out of moisture by that time, that variety won't grow all that dry matter yield that that 60% of its annual dry matter yield that it's supposed to at that time. So we're looking down the path in the future of earlier heading varieties that match the rainfall distribution that's been predicted. Now you can also see on this graph that over the winter period, there's a much greater chance of growth out of your pastures. And that's due to the warmer temperatures we'll be experiencing in winter. They won't be as cold. So we can take advantage of that by choosing certain species that have more production over that winter period, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. Now, one thing that actually concerns me in this graph is the variability that's being shown in autumn, because this is when all the action really happens with temperate pasture species. We sow a lot of our temperate pasture species in that autumn period. And if you have a variable autumn, it's very hard to get perennials established in that time. So I'll talk a bit about pasture planning. You heard a lot about it mentioned last night if you listened in to the talks. And that plan is really, really important to be able to help you get perennials established and persist in getting them to grow on your farm. Now, we've talked about when it comes to different species and what's going to happen, but temperature has a really big effect as well. So these temperate species that we grow, and ryegrass is an example that you can see here on the graph, they're really adapted to much cooler climates. So ryegrass grows best at around about 18 degrees. And you can see as you go past 18 degrees, then its growth rate slows down. So even if I had ryegrass under irrigation, you can see that as temperatures get higher than 18 degrees, and let's say if we got up to 30, you can see quite a rapid decrease in its growth. So what this graph is telling us is that the irrigation might keep these pasture species alive, but they're not growing much for you, or they're decreasing their growth because of those hotter temperatures. So we really want to try and have a lot of that 60% of the annual production around that heading date happening before the temperatures start getting too hot. Now, if you also look at this graph, you can see white clover as a legume seems to have a higher temperature tolerance than what ryegrass does. So that's quite interesting to gather that in, but you can also see that white clover does not grow in cooler soil temperatures as much as what ryegrass does. So we'll talk a bit about that point later on. So here's some example of some data that I took in Southwest Victoria at Yambuk in 2014. It was the driest 7 months on record over that spring-summer period. So we had a very early spring cutout. And what I've done for a comparison here is to have an annual ryegrass versus Italian ryegrasses. Now, the reason why I've chosen them is that annual ryegrasses usually all head on average around about the end of October, and the Italian ryegrasses usually all head around mid to the end of November. And so you can see in the last dry matter measurement here, there was no yield at all from the Italian ryegrasses because they were trying to produce their maximum amount of yield around that heading date, and there was no moisture left in the system to be able to do it. So it really said to me, if I was trying to avoid an early spring finish, I should be choosing annual ryegrasses over late heading Italian types. So in gathering some of that information together, I don't know when you drive around town if you pay attention, but in a lot of towns now they have, it's like a fire chart that each day they adjust it to whatever fire risk is in that area, and it has a color code on it. And we thought, oh, maybe we should develop one of these for perennial ryegrass because there's quite a different range of heading dates in perennial ryegrass, from really early heading types at Boomer at -33 days, right up to Abergain at +25. So what I did in this chart was basically said, okay, if we had an early spring finish, which varieties would be safe to still get the maximum amount of yield out of, and which ones are at high risk of running out of moisture when they're trying to grow their maximum amount of yield around that heading date. And so it gives you a bit of a warning to say, okay, the later you go in your heading dates, the more risk that's involved in that system. And we want to try and avoid as much as that risk as we can. So this chart here, there's a lot of different comparisons of the different perennial grasses that you can get out there today. And what I really want to highlight in this chart for you is we're looking at the winter period. So this area over here where the arrow is, And we're trying to identify species that do most of their growing in winter, because if you can remember back to the graph there where we were looking at the predictions of climate change, it said that we need to really emphasize the winter growth of different species. So the species that grows the most in the perennials over that winter period is the winter active Phalarises. And so that would be one of the main species that you would try and target to get on your farm to grow as much winter feed as possible. Now, I just wanted to show you some examples of a late autumn break. So we seem to be, in the last 10 years, experiencing a lot more of this variability in the autumn season. And these photos here in Southwest Victoria at Yamba show what happens when you have a late autumn break. So in this first photo here, you can see with very minimal amounts of rain in April, the Phalaris was able to start growing again in its second year, along with the Mediterranean tall fescue. You can see the Continental tall fescue at the back is green, but it's a species that tries to grow over the summertime. So it was staying green, but it was really lacking in moisture to be able to grow as much as it could. And over here was the perennial ryegrasses going into their second year, but they're still very yellow and there's no responsive growth to any of the moisture that's there. So if we have a photo here now of the same spot a month later, so in May, and we've got the Phalaris really starting to take off in its growth. The Mediterranean fescue is doing the same. The Continental is starting to slow down in its growth, even though it's looking green because it shuts down over the summertime, the wintertime, sorry. And the perennial ryegrass hasn't started growing yet there at all. And really, the main factor in the response here is about the root depth of the species. So the Phalaris and the Fescues have a much deeper root system than what perennial ryegrass has. And so that root system can access moisture of the minimal amounts of moisture that was around at that time, and they can get actively growing a lot more quickly. So I'll talk about the importance of having perennials as a backbone in your system in that pasture plan to make sure that you're getting growth from minimal amounts of moisture with a poor autumn break. So what are our options for the perennials? So the main thing is we want persistence out of the perennials with productivity. So we're really looking at perennials that should be lasting more than 3 years. If you do the economics and you sit down, you want your perennials to last as long as possible. And by doing that, you're going to get the productivity out of them well at the same time. Now, I just spoke about before with the late autumn breaks. If you have a second year perennial grass growing, it's able to get going with minimal amounts of moisture. Whereas if I have a system that's based on annuals and I have to sow them each year and the break is very late, you can really be put behind the 8 ball, because sowing an annual ryegrass in winter time, so in the beginning of May, it really struggles to produce much feed until you get into spring of the next season. So keep that in mind, that perennials, I think, in the future are the backbone of our system. So those perennials, to get them established though, they germinate slower than what annual species do. So you have to make sure that you have your weeds under control, and the weeds that I'm talking about specifically are annual grass weeds. So annual grass weeds, they are a real problem when you're sowing your perennial grasses late, because as the soil temperatures drop, those annual grass weeds are more adapted to those cooler soil temperatures, whereas the improved perennial grasses that you're sowing aren't so much. So you need to get that weed seed bank under control and decrease the amount of weed seeds that you have in the soil, because we don't have any chemicals, selective herbicides, that we can remove annual grass weeds from our first year perennial grass pastures. So the main thing is start your pasture planning. If you're going to target a paddock planting a perennial in, start it 2 years in advance, because grass seeds last for 2 years in the soil. So if we can have a system of planting annuals for a couple of years, we've got a couple of cycles of knockdown herbicides there that we can take out all the weeds, and we're making sure that none of the grass weeds produce any seeds to drop down to increase the seed bank there. Once you get rid of them, then it's a really much better chance for the perennial grasses that you're sowing to get established and growing well. Now, one thing is to really understand and know your climate. Perennial grasses grow with moisture. You can't make them grow without it. So really try and match your perennial pasture species that you choose to the moisture and rainfall environment that you have in your property. So I can't emphasize that more for you to look at that rainfall distribution or pattern and try and match the growth of your pasture species to that. So I'm going to go through a couple of the different perennial species that you can get in your system, and I'm going to talk about what's sort of happening to them now and how we can improve their persistence in the future. So perennial ryegrass is probably the first one to start with because it's the most commonly sown perennial grass in Australia. Now, it's known for its ease of establishment, its ease of grazing management, and its good forage quality. But over the last 10 to 20 years, we're starting to see challenges towards its persistence. So farmers are looking for other options with perennial ryegrass out there. If I have perennial ryegrass now in my paddocks, there's a couple of different ways you can help to improve its persistence. Now, there's two different mechanisms, I suppose, you could see. There's the perennial ryegrass that are usually early heading types. And what happens with those is that they produce a flowering tiller early on in spring. And before the moisture runs out, they're able to produce what's called a secondary tiller underneath that primary flowering tiller. And it's those secondary tillers that help with survival through the summer. So usually in my trials, I tend to see the early heading types are the ones that have good survival into their second year in the perennial ryegrasses. But I also see another trend, and that's in the tetraploids. I tend to see the tetraploid perennial ryegrasses surviving through the summer as well. And I think that's to do with their higher water-soluble carbohydrate levels. So if you listen to the talk yesterday, Alan spoke about water-soluble carbohydrates there. And those water-soluble carbohydrates in the plants are able to extract more moisture from those soils. Now, in the past, people have said, oh, look, tetraploids don't persist. And I think the reason behind that is that the tetraploids are usually fairly late heading types that grow over the summertime. And of course, when it's dry and we see green in our paddocks, we put the livestock in there to graze it out. So that grazing effect on those plants has a detrimental effect to them. So really, if you're wanting perennial ryegrass to persist, number one, you've got to have really good fertility for it to do well and to survive and persist. And number two, you have to really look at your grazing management. If it's not getting to that 2.5 to 3 leaf stage, you really can't graze it. So over those summer period, you have to go really easy on your perennial ryegrasses. So perennial ryegrass usually sort of grows down to an average rainfall of about 700 mils. Now, the next species that some people look at if they can't get perennial ryegrass to persist is the Continental or summer active tall fescues. Now, the reason why they can survive better than ryegrass, and they can usually survive into rainfalls down to about 600 mils of rain annually, is that...
Anthony, can you just go back and repeat a bit of that? You broke up. There was a bit of bad internet connection there.
Okay, where do you want me to repeat from?
About 30 seconds ago.
Back to perennial ryegrass. Hold on, I'll go back.
No, not that far back. The start of that
with
slide.
Perennial ryegrass. No, righto.
Sorry,
Continental tall fescue. All right.
Yeah, start there. Thank
Continental
you.
or summer active tall fescues. So they have a deep root system, and that's how they're able to survive better than what perennial ryegrass can in lower moisture environments. So they can survive down to 600 mils of annual rainfall, whereas perennial ryegrass is around the 700 mils of annual rainfall. They have a higher tolerance of heat than what perennial ryegrass does, but you have to look at their growth pattern. So their growth pattern of the summer active tall fescues is over the spring, summer, and autumn period. So they really need moisture to be able to grow at that time. So if you have a paddock that maybe in the wintertime gets fairly waterlogged or is wet and you can't really get stock onto, this would be the ideal location where I would sow a Continental tall fescue, because they don't grow much in the wintertime, so you're not going to want to be grazing them over that time. And then that moisture that's in reserve in the soil there over that summer period, those plants with their deep roots can tap into and grow quite considerably. Now, the only thing I must say about the fescues in general is that their heading is very aggressive. So what I mean by that is when they start to flower, they become very reproductive and put up a lot of fibrous flowering stems. So their management is quite critical at this time. You have to graze them with rotations of less than 14 days and graze them quite hard with livestock. And you'll find that you might be able to get away with it with beef and dairy cows, but with sheep, they're not quite as keen to eat the flowering heads of the fescues. So that's just something to keep in mind. Also, they need fairly warm soil temperatures, the summer active tall fescues, to get established. They're a species that goes sort of partly dormant over the winter time. So if we're sowing them in autumn and it's getting late when you're sowing them because of a late autumn break, you have to have really good weed control, because they're going to sort of shut down in their growth over that winter period and grow very slowly. So out of the perennial grasses, they're about the second slowest to germinate, just behind Cocksfoots. So a close cousin to them is the Mediterranean tall fescue, or winter active tall fescue. And what's different about them is they have a different growth pattern. So they actually grow in autumn, winter, and spring. And by doing that, they're actually able to grow in lower annual rainfall environments. So they can sort of go into environments of around 400 to 500 mils of rainfall. So they have the ability to go summer dormant, which is a really key important factor, especially for our environment here in Australia. And that helps them survive into the following years. They do have that same flowering issue that you tend to see with the summer active tall fescues. They're quite aggressive in their flowering, so you have to keep right on top of them to get past that period of reproductiveness in the plants. One thing I must say, and where I see a really good fit for this species, is that with Phalaris, it's a great companion species with that, and not so much putting it in mixtures with Phalaris, but actually having it in a separate paddock. And if you've grown Phalaris before, you would find that there's certain times where Phalaris can be toxic to livestock, and that's usually over the autumn period. So Mediterranean tall fescue doesn't have any of those toxicity issues. So when the Phalaris is toxic, you're able to move livestock off that Phalaris and put it onto the Mediterranean tall fescue and graze the livestock on there, and then you can move them back when there's more rainfall and the Phalaris isn't as much stressed as what it would be with a false autumn break. So if I was to make a prediction in the future, I would really say that Phalaris will become probably the most dominant perennial pasture species in Australia in the future, because it's really matching the growth pattern that we're likely to see with climate change. It's going to be, it grows over that autumn, winter, spring period, and that's ideally when we want species to grow, when there's moisture there for them to do it. Its ability to survive is due to its deep root system. So it has roots down to 1.5 meters, where ryegrass would have roots down less than a meter. So that's the way that it's able to survive. But they have found during the droughts in New South Wales that Phalaris has struggled to persist in those environments. So we'll talk about another species next off after Phalaris that might suit those types of environments in the future. It has a great forage quality if it's managed correctly, if it's not allowed to grow too tall. And from a germination point of view, it's just behind perennial ryegrass for its emergence figure. So you still have to control the annual grass weeds with Phalaris because, as I said, we don't have any chemical options for taking those annual grass weeds out of Phalaris in their first year. Now, I did highlight the toxicity issues with Phalaris. There is two types of toxicity with Phalaris. There's Phalaris staggers, and that's caused by an alkaloid in Phalaris called tryptamine. So newer bred varieties are low in tryptamine, so they don't cause as much of those staggers as what you would see. And then those staggers happen around a false autumn break. So you have a bit of rain, the Phalaris shoots up, it dries off again because the rain dries out, and then you get those toxicity issues. Another toxicity problem that there is there with Phalaris is sudden death. Now, this is pretty rare, so it's you usually see it in Australian Phalaris stands, and with those Australian Phalaris stands, with false autumn break again, you can find sheep die on them overnight, and so that's why I suggest if you have that false autumn break, to have a safety paddock like the Mediterranean tall fescue to put your Phalaris in. There's sort of two groups of your Phalarises. There's your winter active sort of erect types that need rotational grazing, and they're based off the breeding of Serosa, and that's the majority of what the varieties are sold in Phalaris here today in Australia. And there's also the Australian types, which are more summer active, and semi-prostrate types, which are more suited to set stocking. So they're the two Phalarises that you can get out there in the marketplace. So over trials from 2005 to 2007, and that included the real drought year in the southeastern states of Australia, the only variety that was able to persist with rainfalls of down to 200 mils of rain were Cocksfoots. So they're incredibly drought tolerant, but I must give you a warning there that there's quite a lot of diversity in Cocksfoots. So Cocksfoots can be either very winter active summer dormant types, or very summer active and not much winter growth types. So you have to be careful in choosing what type of Cocksfoot you're going to sow. Cocksfoots are quite different to the other species in the perennial group because they don't have quite a deep root system as what the other species do. They actually have a better way of extracting moisture from the soil. They have stronger pumps, you could say, that suck moisture out of the soil better. So Cocksfoots work really well on those shallower soils that tend to dry out. They have a much better ability for surviving under those conditions. They can drop in their palatability around the flowering time compared to other species. So you can either try and keep on them with grazing pressure, or actually increase the legume content in those Cocksfoot pastures. So those legumes with their extra digestibility allow stock to actually eat more of the lignin and the flowering stems that you tend to see there. And yeah, I think my prediction would be in the future, where we're struggling to get Phalaris to persist, it's going to be Cocksfoot that species is going to fill that gap in that locations around Australia. So out of the legumes, there's really one that's the most perennial, I suppose, and persistent, and that's Lucerne, and I call that the green oasis in the summer desert. So Lucerne is amazing when you drive around. When most of the grasses have stopped growing, you can still find green paddocks of Lucerne, and it's due to that really deep taproot that Lucerne can put down to 2 meters or more into the soil. Now, there's a couple of Achilles heels with Lucerne that make it a challenge to get planted on your farm. It doesn't like acid soils, and it doesn't like waterlogging. And there's the issue of bloat with cattle as well. So you have to get those under control with your management and agronomy. And once you've got them under control, you really, Lucerne is a perfect species to have on your farm. Now, I don't know if you remember back to that graph that I showed you of the temperatures that ryegrass and the legumes grow at, but you could see that in the wintertime, legumes grow much less than what the grasses do. So be aware that you're not going to get much winter activity out of your species of Lucerne. But Lucernes come ranked as their winter active types right through to winter dormant types. So a winter active type has a score of 10, and then the winter dormant types are scored around 2 or 3. But don't be misled by a variety being called winter active, because a winter active 10 type will probably only grow about 30% of its annual dry matter yield over that winter period. So farmers will probably oversow annual grasses or cereals into the lucerne to boost up their winter activity. So I'm just going to summarize everything for you. And if you've ever been to my field days before, you would hear me commenting about these points again and again, but I can't really emphasize them enough. So hopefully when I die one day, they'll sketch it onto my gravestone or something like that. But you only get one shot at really establishing your perennial pastures. In that first year, if you have a poor establishment, that's what you're going to have forever after. And if it's a poor establishment, you're going to have problems with weeds until that perennial pasture is gone. So you really need to keep control of those weeds, and don't rush and make shortcuts. You can't just decide to go into perennial in autumn and put it in without any preparation at all, because it's going to really increase your chances of failure. Now, look, if a perennial doesn't work, don't give up on them, because find out why it didn't work. You know, it could have been due to lack of moisture, it could have been due to some sort of agronomy practice, and we learn from those experiences. So maybe if you are trying perennials for the first time, try them in a small area, get as much advice as you can about them, and as you gain more experience in putting them in, expand the area that you're putting them in on your farm. Look, many farmers ask me, okay, what's the best variety out there in the marketplace? And the reply I give back to them is there's no silver bullet out there. They just don't exist. There's no one variety that can do everything. So if you have a variety and you really like it and you decide to plant it all over your farm, it might do well in one year, and then in the next year, it could perform quite poorly when the season's totally different. And so what I'm trying to get at is, don't put all your eggs into one basket. The way we can get around this climate change and climate variability is to have diversity of species on your farm. So I'm not talking about putting all your species into one bag and then sowing them all in the same paddock. I'm talking about having those species separate from one another, so you can manage them appropriately for their grazing needs, for their fertility needs, all those different factors, so that you can get the most production and the most persistence out of them on your farm. And I know it can be daunting when you think about some of the tough seasons that we've had and some of the tough seasons that we could possibly have in the future. And we're always going to have a variable climate in Australia, but I think we have the opportunity to make it much more higher in pasture yields, and so we can make it an advantage, not a disadvantage, to be living in Australia and being based off a perennial grass system. So that's my real feeling on the whole thing for you. So thanks for listening to my talk tonight. Look, I grew up on a dairy farm down in southwest Victoria and that as well, and I was lucky enough to become a plant breeder. It was what I was passionate about in my life, and more so I was lucky enough to find a position with Valley Seeds as a plant breeder, because I saw what the climate was going to be like in Australia in the future, and I said to myself, it's really Australia where this breeding work needs to be done, not overseas. And so I just thank Valley Seeds for giving me that opportunity to be able to do that breeding work and help Australian farmers out with the challenges they have. So thanks, and if there's any questions, I'll try and answer them as best as I can.
Thank you, Anthony. We do have a couple of questions. So I'll start with the first one. When would you suggest to graze a newly sown perennial pasture?
Depends on the species, because they all have different emergence vigor, so how fast they get out of the ground. So I know the fastest to emerge would be perennial ryegrass. So you'd be sort of grazing that in, a rough prediction, depending on how early you got it in and everything like that. You might be grazing that between 8 and 12 weeks. And I always say, okay, do that pull test. So go into the paddock, grab the plants. Are they pulling out or are they breaking off? And if the leaves are snapping and breaking off, you've got the chance to get in and have an early grazing and help them tiller out. So that's my suggestion there.
Okay. Then we've actually got someone who's asked for you to look at one in slides again. It was in regards to the perennial ryegrass. I think you call it your traffic light or your fire emergency slide.
All right.
And it's actually
chart 22030.
Hold
it's
on.
about
Which one?
Keep going back
That
to the one that
Okay.
has the red and yellow and green. Yeah.
one?
So on that one, can you tell us more about the early valley seeds, perennial ryegrasses? Why would you have that early? And why also does it seem that valley seeds only have low endophyte in perennial ryegrass? There's two questions in there, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So really, like I said before, 60% of the annual dry winter yields around that heading date. So heading date's a really good tool to spread feed out around your property. So if you were to try and generate more coming out of winter, early spring feed, those early heading types really do that for you. If you wanted to generate more later feed into the season, that's where the late heading types do it for you. So like I said, when it comes to varieties, don't put all your eggs into one basket. If you've got areas where you know might hold the moisture longer, like it was a river flat or down at the bottom of the hill, those late heading types would be suited to that area, or on the southern side of a hill that doesn't get as much sun. And then areas where you know that will finish off earlier, maybe it's the soil type or something like that, that's where you put the early heading types. So they're going to be able to get
Anthony,
that heading out of the way, and that's 60% of their dry matter yield, and they won't run out of moisture while they're trying to do it. Oh, am I back?
Yep, you're back. And
yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. All right.
And the endophyte component?
Oh, yeah. So I'll try and make a long story short. Back when endophytes are first identified in about 1980, in New Zealand, there was two paths that were followed. So the New Zealanders looked at, they removed the endophyte from the grass, and they found that when the endophyte was removed from those grasses, they didn't persist as well due to insect pressure over in New Zealand. And so they started selecting for novel endophyte types, so endophytes that didn't cause the toxins that cause animal issues. In Australia, our breeders went down a different path. We said, okay, we're more probably interested in the genetics of the plant and their heading date compared to the endophyte itself. So we put space plants in the ground, and we selected plants that were able to persist without endophyte. So we found over time that the protection that the endophyte is giving is for insects that are generally over in New Zealand. They're not actually here in Australia. So if you think about our environment in Australia, we experience pretty dry summers, and it's over those summers is where the insects grow and develop. So in New Zealand, in their pastures, they have a lot of summer growth, and that's why they have bad insect problems. Here in Australia, we don't have those insect problems. So if you're really interested in the topic about endophyte and want to learn more about it, there's a guy in the US called David Cheplick. He's from a university over there, and so if you can access his papers, I might be able to put some links up to them on our website. He has a non-biased view of endophytes, and his comment basically is, okay, really look at selecting your genetics of your plants first, because that's really important to match that to the environment before you even start considering is an endophyte important or not.
Okay, that's a pretty good summary. Next one, as climate gets drier in the spring, should I use early maturing ryegrasses and let them set seed to get better persistence?
Yeah, for me, I would, it's, as I said in my system, I would try and have a variable system. So you might look at early heading types and let them set seed. But remember, when you do lock them up for seed, you're taking them out of your system for probably 8 to 10 weeks nearly. And so that's a hell of a lot of dry matter that you're locking up and shutting away that you can't graze with livestock. So by the time you let them back in, usually we say a figure is that for every day you see a seed head emerging, you're losing 0.5% digestibility in your grass. So by the time you let them in, when the seeds mature, so that the seed will shatter down and you'll get seedling recruitment, the quality of that feed is pretty poor. So I would say, okay, maybe do one or two paddocks using that method because the seedling recruitment will also help with the secondary tillers surviving through the summer. But I would look more so at other perennial species that have a much deeper root system that can survive chasing that last bit of moisture over that spring going into summer period. So I mean, I don't know where your location is, where the question's coming from, but, you know, locations at Yark, where we have our research station in northeast Victoria, its rainfall is around 500 annual annual rainfall is around 500 mils, and you can't really kill Phalaris there. It just keeps growing. Whereas the last summer that we went through, it was one of the driest ones I've experienced there in my 12 years, and it was killing off the summer active Cocksfoots were dying, the summer active or Continental tall Fescues were dying, and the perennial ryegrass was dead. That was definitely gone. And the only species that sort of survived and worked pretty well were the Phalarises, the winter active tall Fescues, and the summer dormant Cocksfoots.
Thank you. Now, the next one. Sorry, just bear with me. I've just got to uncover it. How much of pasture's persistence is due to variety and how much comes down to management?
I would say that management has a much stronger influence than the variety. So if you planted a variety, it went into poor fertility, it wasn't grazed very well, there was a lot of competition with weeds, the chances of it surviving are pretty slim. So get those management right, because varieties now come with a management package. So we don't try and sell you a variety, we sell you the package with it. So it mightn't be just one variety. We might recommend to you, okay, as a partner, you should be trying to sow this other species in the paddock next door with it, because to try and take the pressure off that variety when it's dry or whatever, you can move the livestock onto this other paddock, and that is able to give you less pressure on that species, so it will persist. So all I can say to you is that pasture management is going to get more complex in the future because we're going to have to use more diversity of species within our system to get it all to work. And so it's going to need more time and more management and more knowledge involved in it. But farmers can do it with the agronomists and that they have there, but we really need to put more emphasis on our pastures and getting the persistent and to be productive.
Okay, I'll make this the last one because the time is getting on. You mentioned that Cocksfoot's drought tolerance varies a lot. Can you please elaborate how I can tell which variety will persist best?
Well, if you were targeting a Cocksfoot that's the most persistent, you would look for the Hispanica types. So you might see that in their name or their terminology. So anything that's a Hispanica type of Cocksfoot is what we call the summer dormant types. So they're so dormant that you can plant them in a paddock and irrigate it, and they look like they're dead in the summer. They don't grow even when they're irrigated. So their dormancy is that strong. So then when the autumn period comes again, there's a trigger of those lower temperatures, which say to the grass, okay, it's time to start growing again, and that's when they become active. So a lot of those Hispanica types have come from Northern Africa, and I did some collections over in Spain and in Israel, and we were going down into environments of around about 200 mils of rain, and the only perennial species that would survive and that was alive in those environments was Cocksfoot. So yeah, look for those Hispanica types of Cocksfoot.
Okay, well, thank you. There's been some great questions there. We're going to finish up now as we've run out of time. What we'll do is email out questions and answer documents in the next few days with the questions that we didn't get onto tonight and provide answers from our team. Please don't forget to check out our videos. They are part of our virtual online open days. And before we go, we'd like to thank Anthony for his time, and also the many people behind the scenes who've helped make this event real. And of course, thank our audience and all the supporters of Valley Seeds over the years. We hope that you found this session interesting. You'll receive a copy of the webinar recording in the next day or two and a survey. Could you please help us by completing the survey so we know how to improve going forward? Thank you.